It was 9 p.m., and Jack Reeves was sitting in his usual spot in the dimly lit pub, sipping a pint of beer that had long since warmed up. It was a typical Friday night at the Rose and Crown, with stale ale and the faint aroma of greasy pub food. He knew the place well because he lived just around the corner in his council flat, where the regulars were already deep in their drinks, laughing too loudly at jokes that were completely unfunny, and gripping their usual grievances. The pub was filling up nicely. He was waiting as he always did for the customers to reach the ideal level of inebriation, just enough to be open to suggestions but not so drunk that they couldn't follow along. He had been coming to this pub for years. He had perfected his little scam. Now it was effortless. The locals loved it. He enjoyed it too in his own way. It was simple money and straightforward fun. And it became even easier as the drinks piled up throughout the evening. A few vague predictions. Some man talk about the veil between worlds, and he'd have them eating out of his hand. Of course, Mark didn't believe in ghost spirits or the afterlife. It was all complete nonsense to him, but he had always been a powerful talker with boundless charisma, and that was all that mattered. People wanted to believe, and he simply gave them what they wanted. In his mind, he was providing a service to people who required it. As the night progressed, he noticed a group of newcomers in the bar. They must have been co-workers on a night out. Some of them still wore their badges around their necks. They appeared to be having a wonderful time as they laughed and clinked glasses. They must have had more than a few drinks at this point. Perfect, he thought, like a predator surveying its prey. He closely observed them at the bar as one of the group got up to use the restroom. He noticed them stumble with that classic unsteadiness on their feet that comes after a certain number of drinks. It was time to go. He rose from his seat, took a deep breath, and smiled his most disarming and mysterious smile. His dark hair was slicked back and his shirt was slightly wrinkled, giving him a disheveled charm. He approached the group with casual confidence. He wanted them to underestimate him and, more importantly, consider his suggestions. Evening, people, he said in a low, buttery voice. Do you mind if I join you? They glanced up and stared at Al for a moment, but he could tell they were interested. Occasionally, he approached groups who told him to get lost right away, but he overcame this first hurdle by assuming that the group's most senior member was there. A tall man with a well-groomed beard nodded. Sure, buddy, tell me about yourself. The bearded man arched an eyebrow in doubt as he laughed and took an empty seat from a nearby table. My name is Mark, and I'm the local psychologist who has been coming here for years to give spirit readings to those who are interested. A psychic? Well, that's different, but it's instructive. Mark replied by leaning in as though revealing a secret. I'm skilled at communicating with the dead and the spirit realm. As he talked, the group looked at each other, and he quickly darted his eyes across their expressions, with several displaying deep incredulity. Others, who seemed intrigued, felt the concept was absurd, but fortunately, they were intoxicated enough to find it funny. All right, said the bearded man with a sly smile, why don't you give us a reading? The group appeared confused until Mark broke the illusion by holding out his hand with 30 pounds. Since it was a large group with plenty of money, they decided to entertain him, and the bearded man did a quick whip round. Some of the group took $5 and $1 bills out of their pockets, and he handed him a small wad of cash. Most importantly, Mark used his most corny mystical voice to help maintain the illusion and disarm them. Mark lowered his head and put the cash he would need for drinks that evening in his pocket. You have my gratitude, and with the most important part completed, Mark began the performance. He adored skeptics because they were the most easily duped. He took a small worn deck of tarot cards from his pocket and spread it out on the table. He persevered despite the sticky table from the previous night's spilled beer. Let's see what the spirits have to say this evening. He began his usual routine, which he must have done hundreds of times by now. He didn't need to think about it, it was instinctive. He shuffled the cards expertly. I asked someone in the group to draw one. As he turned the card over, he told a story of ambiguous predictions and half-truths. He repeated this a few times, eventually getting everyone in the group to pick a card and him interpreting the results. The group laughed the entire time, occasionally looking around as if expecting something, but nothing happened. Of course, it was all performance and theatrics, which was entertaining on a Friday night. Mark finished the reading with an exaggerated flourish, leaning back in his chair. And there you have it, gentlemen, the spirits have spoken. Mark's performance had piqued the interest of others in the pub, and as the reading went on, the audience became larger. The landlord and bartenders avidly watched the events unfold as the bearded man clapped his hands, and the others followed in after a time. It wasn't terrible, buddy. There was something special in the air, and Mark realized that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He felt that most of the pub patrons wanted more, and if he went around collecting money from them, he could make a good profit. They wanted to be impressed, scared, and have a genuine experience. As the audience exchanged excited looks, the showman in him took over and raised his voice to acknowledge the enthralled audience around him. He asked, "Ladies and gentlemen, do you want to go a little deeper?" And then looked around, noticing nods from the audience, realizing he had their attention. He then lowered his voice to a whisper. "There are other, more intense ways to contact the spirits." One of the women behind him answered, "Yes, go ahead." In order to create the right mood, the landlord reached over and turned the dimmer switch on the wall, making the pub feel cozier and more intimate. One of the bartenders even discovered a few tiny candles in metal cups, so they placed 2 of them on a table and lit them. Mark smiled. Mark took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and spread his hands across the table. This was new territory for him. He had never felt this much interest before, but the pull was too strong not to pursue. He was also a master of improvisation, so he wasn't worried. He began reciting a few lines of gibberish that he was sure he had heard on some obscure TV show years ago, but he thought it sounded appropriately mystical. As Mark continued his chant, the now large group watched and paid attention to their previously forgotten skepticism. At first, he felt a slight chill that seemed to creep in out of nowhere, giving him goosebumps, but he dismissed it as a draft from a nearby window. There was a lengthy lull, so if you are among us, please make your presence known. Tonight, his stage presence was evident. He needed to wait long enough to build tension without losing believability. The group watched him wait. Mark couldn't stop smiling, ready to say something clever about how the spirits were shy tonight, but before he could, the lights in the pub flickered. The sudden change startled the group, and one of the women surrounding him let out a nervous laugh. "Nice touch," she said, her voice shaky but to his pleasing concern. Mark had not done anything unexpected, and he looked around, his steely confidence wavering for the first time. It must have been a coincidence, a flaw in the wiring, or something. This was an old pub, and he was sure the electrics weren't in excellent shape. He decided to embrace the situation. His voice was now booming, a volatile combination of fear, uncertainty, and adrenaline. "The spirits are restless," he said, attempting to keep his cool. "They're reaching out to us with concern." He continued his chant, but there was a new edge to his voice, a tension he had never felt before. The chill in the air intensified, seeping into his bones. He began shivering. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the group shifting uncomfortably, their earlier excitement fading into something else closer to fear. The lights flickered again, more violently. The entire pub seemed to shudder, as if a heavy weight had fallen on it. Mark swallowed hard, his mouth quickly drying. "Is this part of it?" the bearded man inquired, his tone uncertain. They knew subconsciously that this was just a performance, but something was off. He could detect worry and fear in his voice when Mark tried to reply. The words became trapped in his throat like a vice. Mark felt real fear for the first time in years as the temperature in the room continued to drop and a low hum filled the air. He could see a mist start to descend every time he exhaled, and the hum seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating in his skull. It was an incredibly unpleasant sensation. The showman in him resisted his primal instincts and opened his eyes to survey the pub. Most of the patrons seemed frightened or anxious, and the faint chatter that had accompanied his performance had now died down. The landlord, a burly man named Tom, scowled from behind the bar and used a rag to wipe his hands. "What's going on, buddy?" When the spell seemed to be broken, the landlord's initial curiosity changed to confusion when Tom's voice broke through the eerie hum. The hum continued to grow louder and more insistent. The lights flickered constantly, the glasses on the table started to rattle, and the sound of clinking wine glasses reverberated throughout the pub. Mark tried to pause the performance to close any connections he had unintentionally opened, but the words would not come. Mark's face went pale and his hands began to shake, revealing his panic. "This isn't right," he murmured, his voice barely heard over the ear-piercing buzz. "What do you mean?" The bearded man remarked, his voice shaking. "Isn't this part of the show?" Mark shook his head angrily and took ragged, short breaths. "No, I didn't. This shouldn't have happened." The hum had intensified to a fever pitch, the lights had abruptly gone out, and the group stared at him with a mixture of terror and bewilderment on their faces. Then, as if in slow motion, the glasses on the table shattered into a million pieces, the sound of breaking glass filling the air as shards flew in all directions, glinting in the faint light of the street lamps outside. The wine glasses hanging from the bar also exploded, forcing the bartenders to duck for cover. Into the darkness, a few members of the group screamed, breaking the sudden silence. Mark could feel terror rising in the room, a tangible sensation pressing against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. Mark flinched behind the bar, raising his arms to protect himself and reflexively closing his eyes. He could hear the group screaming in terror as they tried to flee, but he was immobile, unable to move, and the darkness closed in around him was dense and oppressive. He felt a demonic and vindictive presence in the room with them, as if the air had turned against him. Taking his life with every ragged breath, please Mark the spirit had waited far too long for this, feeding off of years of his deceit, growing stronger with each lie he said, and it was now free. Gab gasped, his voice shaking, "I didn't mean to, please stop the spirit from listening." Mark attempted to scream for help, but nothing came out. His vision blurred and the corners of the room darkened as his head throbbed with pain. He couldn't see them, but the group's screams had faded into oaths silence. They remained motionless, almost afraid to move for fear of what might happen next, until the pain spread sharp and stabbing, unbearable. It was as if invisible hands were twisting and bending his limbs in ways they weren't supposed to. He could feel his bones grinding and his muscles tearing, but he couldn't move or scream. Blood began to seep from his nose, eyes and ears dripping in thick dark droplets on the table and the floor. The surrounding group watched in horror, their faces paled, but they remained motionless. They could not believe what they were witnessing. To them it had to be part of the ACT, an elaborate yet gruesome performance. They had never seen anything like it. He must have been a very skilled performer, but Mark knew better. This was not a performance, it was real. And it was the end. The unbearable pressure in his chest intensified, and with a final agonizing twist, something snapped deep within him. When the lights returned, Mark lay still on the table, surrounded by glass fragments, his limbs twisted at strange angles, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, and blood pooled around him, staining the wooden floor and table. His body twisted one last time, a final violent spasm, and everything went black. He had given his last and most potent reading. Everybody in the pub was stunned, and then, as if on cue, the crowd erupted in thunderous applause that shook the walls as they applauded and cheered all around. Many in the crowd were shaking, their heads turned in shock, and smiles started to appear on their faces as their fear gave way to admiration for what they considered to be the most convincing performance they had ever seen. Reeves, Jack unaware of the truth, the pub patrons raised the few glasses left in a toast, laughing and applauding the spectacular show, but something dark and hungry lingered in the shadows, feeding on the crowd's excitement and fear. It had claimed its first victim, and it was only getting started. After a short while, the laughter and applause faded into silence once more as the audience realized the seriousness of what had just happened. As the rain started to fall outside the dimly lit pub, they all realized that they could see their breath-forming clouds of mist in front of them. The silence was broken by loud screams that started to fill the air. The demon had everything it could possibly need, and it would eventually eat them all up.